The candles guttered in the pre-dawn darkness of Greenwich Palace as the most powerful person in England lay dying in agony. It was July 6th, 1553, and the putrid smell of decay had been seeping from the royal chambers for weeks. Courtiers pressed perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces as they maintained their death vigil, not from grief, but from necessity. The boy king's body had turned a sickly green, his hair falling out in clumps, his fingernails dropping like autumn leaves onto the silk sheets that could no longer mask the stench of his rotting flesh. Edward VI, 15 years old and sovereign of 3 million souls, writhed in his final hours, but even as poison coursed through his veins, the same arsenic his own physicians had unknowingly fed him in their desperate attempts to cure his tuberculosis. His fevered mind remained fixed not on salvation or forgiveness, but on a darker obsession. Between screams of physical torment, he whispered final instructions to his conspirators: complete the purification of England. Burn the Catholics. Kill his sister Mary before she could claim his throne. The boy, who had dreamed of watching his own sister die at the stake, was himself being consumed from within. His body, rebelling against the hatred that had poisoned his soul long before arsenic had poisoned his blood. Most Americans know the Tudor story, or think they do. Henry VIII and his 6 wives. The bloated tyrant who broke with Rome for love. Bloody Mary, who burned 300 Protestants at the stake. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen who defeated the Spanish Armada and ushered in England's golden age. But there's another Tudor, one whose story has been carefully sanitized by centuries of historians uncomfortable with its implications. Edward VI, the boy king, whose 6-year reign makes his father's brutality look like amateur hour. What if I told you that the most dangerous Tudor wasn't the one who killed 300 people, but the one who died before he could kill 300,000? What if the greatest monster of the 16th century was a child who never lived to see his 16th birthday? This is the story of how absolute power, religious fanaticism, and deliberate isolation can transform an innocent child into something that would make modern cult leaders seem restrained by comparison. It's a tale that resonates uncomfortably in our age of child influencers, political dynasties, and ideological extremism. Because Edward VI wasn't just a king, he was a weapon, carefully crafted by adults who thought they could control him, only to discover they had created something beyond their worst nightmares. By the time you finish this story, you'll understand why Edward's early death may have been not just England's salvation, but one of history's great mercies. And you'll never again assume that evil requires years to mature, or that the young are innocent until proven otherwise. The Making of a Monster. October 12th, 1537. Hampton Court Palace erupted in celebration as the news spread. Henry VIII finally had his male heir. After 28 years of marriage, 2 divorces, and 2 beheadings, the king who had torn England apart in his quest for a son could finally rest easy. The infant prince was perfect healthy, legitimate, and most importantly, male. But Edward Tudor's birth came with a price that would shadow his entire existence. 12 days after bringing the future king into the world, Jane Seymour began hemorrhaging. In an age before antiseptics or blood transfusions, there was nothing the royal physicians could do but watch as the queen, who had given Henry everything he wanted, slowly bled to death. She died on October 24th. Her final words, reportedly a plea for God to bless her infant son. From his first breath, Edward was marked as the prince who cost his mother's life, a living symbol of both salvation and death. Henry VIII, finally achieving his dynastic dreams only to lose the one wife he had genuinely loved, poured his guilt into an obsessive protection of his son that bordered on worship. The infant wasn't just the heir to the throne. He was England's miracle, the answer to 3 decades of dynastic uncertainty. The palace became Edward's prison, though no one called it that. Guards surrounded him constantly, not just to protect him from physical harm, but from any influence that might corrupt his precious mind. Visitors were screened with the intensity of modern security clearances. Even his wet nurses were chosen not for their motherly qualities, but for their unquestioning Protestant orthodoxy. Henry, consumed by guilt over Jane's death and paranoid about Edward's safety, began treating his son less like a child and more like a sacred relic. The boy couldn't simply be raised. He had to be perfected, molded into the ideal Protestant king who would justify all of Henry's sins and secure the Tudor dynasty forever. Every aspect of Edward's upbringing was calculated to remind him that he wasn't just special. He was literally God's chosen instrument on earth. This wasn't love in any recognizable sense. It was the desperate devotion of a man who saw his son as both his redemption and his legacy, with no room for the child's own humanity. Edward learned, before he could even speak properly, that his value lay not in who he was, but in what he represented. He was the future of England, the hope of Protestantism, the vindication of his father's bloody reign. And if something that precious couldn't be allowed to simply be a child, what hope did he have of ever becoming a normal human being? Edward's 6th birthday marked the end of whatever remained of his childhood. Henry VIII, now convinced that his son's education couldn't be delayed any longer, assembled what he considered the finest tutorial team in Europe. But these weren't ordinary teachers. They were Protestant revolutionaries disguised as scholars. Men who saw the young prince not as a student to be educated, but as clay to be molded into their perfect weapon against Catholic Europe. John Check, Edward's primary tutor, was a brilliant Cambridge scholar whose academic credentials masked a fanatical hatred of Catholicism that would have impressed the Spanish Inquisition. Roger Ascham, brought in to teach languages and literature, filtered every classical text through the lens of Protestant supremacy. Together, they designed what amounted to the most sophisticated brainwashing program in history, one that would make modern cult indoctrination techniques look primitive by comparison. Edward's daily routine was a carefully choreographed descent into extremism. He woke each morning at 6 to recite Latin prayers, not traditional Catholic prayers, but newly composed Protestant liturgies that emphasized God's special relationship with Reformed monarchs. Breakfast was accompanied by readings from Protestant martyrologies, ensuring that Edward's first meal of the day came seasoned with detailed accounts of Catholic persecution. By 8 o'clock, Edward was deep in theological instruction that would have challenged university students. But this wasn't academic theology. It was warfare disguised as education. Czech didn't teach Edward about different religious perspectives. He taught him why Catholics deserved death. Every lesson began with the fundamental premise that Protestantism was God's truth, and that any deviation from it was not just wrong, but actively evil. History lessons were particularly insidious. Edward learned about English kings, but only through the filter of religious conflict. Henry VIII's victory at Agincourt became a story about God blessing Protestant virtue. The Hundred Years' War was reframed as an early struggle between English Protestant virtue and French Catholic corruption. Every historical event, from the Roman invasion to the Wars of the Roses, was interpreted as preparation for Edward's destined role as Protestantism's greatest champion. Afternoons brought what Czech called statecraft, but which was really instruction in absolute rule. Edward learned that kings weren't bound by the same moral laws as ordinary people because they were God's representatives on earth. Opposition to royal will wasn't just rebellion, it was blasphemy. Mercy toward religious enemies wasn't virtue, it was weakness that God would punish. The most chilling evidence of this indoctrination's success came when Edward was just 7 years old. During a routine lesson about religious policy, Czech asked his pupil why heretics should be punished. Facade. Most children might have struggled with such an abstract concept, but Edward calmly explained that heretics were like cancers in the body of Christ, and that just as a surgeon cuts away diseased flesh to save the patient, kings must cut away diseased souls to save the kingdom. When Czech pressed him about the morality of burning people alive, Edward replied without hesitation that fire purified both the heretic's soul and the nation's spiritual health. This wasn't the innocent parroting of lessons learned by rote. Court observers noted that Edward spoke about religious violence with genuine enthusiasm, his eyes lighting up as he described the theological benefits of various forms of execution. At an age when most children were learning basic arithmetic, Edward was developing sophisticated theories about the spiritual necessity of mass murder. The isolation that enabled this indoctrination was perhaps even more damaging than the lessons themselves. Edward had no playmates, no normal childhood experiences, no exposure to people who saw him as anything other than England's future savior. His only companions were adults who treated every word he spoke as profound wisdom, every childish whim as divine inspiration. By his 9th birthday, Edward had become something unprecedented in English history, a child who understood complex political and theological concepts but had no grasp of basic human empathy. He could construct elaborate intellectual justifications for cruelty, but he had never experienced friendship, innocent play, or unconditional love. He was brilliant, articulate, and completely inhuman. The physical architecture of Edward's world reflected the psychological prison his tutors had constructed around his mind. Hampton Court and Greenwich Palace had been transformed into something resembling a monastery crossed with a fortress, where every interaction was scripted and every relationship served the purpose of reinforcing Edward's sense of divine destiny. Edward's living quarters occupied an entire wing of whatever palace he inhabited, but despite their luxury, They functioned more like a laboratory than a home. His chambers were filled with books, maps, and instruments of learning, but contained nothing that might remind him he was a child. No toys, no games, no objects designed purely for pleasure or innocent amusement. Even his food was chosen not for taste, but for its symbolic value. Meals planned to reinforce lessons about Protestant virtue and royal authority. The prince's daily schedule was regulated with monastic precision. He woke at the same time each morning, followed the same routine of prayers and study, ate the same types of meals at precisely appointed hours. This wasn't just organization, it was conditioning, designed to make Edward see regimentation and control as natural and desirable. He learned to find comfort in rules and systems, preparing him to impose that same rigid order on an entire kingdom. Most damaging of all was Edward's complete isolation from other children. Henry VIII had decreed that the prince couldn't risk exposure to the corrupting influence of normal childhood. But this decision created something far worse than corruption. It created a human being who had never learned to relate to his peers as equals. Edward knew how to command adults and how to receive their worship, but he had no understanding of friendship, play, or the give and take of normal human relationships. The few children who did enter Edward's world came as carefully selected playmates, chosen not for their compatibility with Edward, but for their family's Protestant credentials and political usefulness. These interactions were supervised, scripted, and designed to reinforce Edward's sense of superiority rather than teach him social skills. The other children were instructed to defer to Edward in all things, to treat his every word as wisdom, and to express gratitude for the privilege of his company. By age 8, the warning signs of Edward's psychological development were becoming impossible to ignore, though his tutors interpreted them as evidence of their success rather than reasons for concern. Edward designed his own coat of arms featuring angels wielding flaming swords to destroy Catholic churches. He kept detailed journals of executions he had read about, rating their effectiveness and suggesting improvements. When his physicians visited for routine examinations, Edward would pepper them with questions about anatomy, not from innocent curiosity about how bodies worked, but from a specific interest in how pain could be inflicted most efficiently. Most disturbing of all was Edward's reaction to Henry VIII's death in January 1547. While normal children might have grieved the loss of their father, Edward's primary emotion seemed to be excitement about finally being able to implement the lessons his tutors had taught him. Within hours of hearing about Henry's death, Edward was already discussing which of his father's policies had been too moderate and which advisors would need to be replaced with more committed Protestants. The 9-year-old who ascended the throne on January 28, 1547, was the product of the most sophisticated program of psychological manipulation in history. He was brilliant, articulate, and utterly convinced of his own divine mission. He understood complex theological and political concepts that would have challenged university professors, but he had never experienced a moment of normal human emotion or formed a single healthy relationship. Edward VI was not just a king, he was a weapon, carefully crafted by adults who thought they could control him. What they failed to understand was that they had created something that would soon be beyond anyone's control. including his own. The last restraint on Edward's extremism had been his father's authority, and now that authority was gone, England was about to discover what happened when absolute power fell into the hands of someone who had been taught that mercy was weakness, that opposition was blasphemy, and that the suffering of others was not just acceptable, but necessary for the greater glory of God. The boy king was about to show his subjects that there were forms of tyranny far worse than anything his notorious father had ever imagined. January 28th, 1547. Westminster Abbey had never witnessed a coronation quite like this one. As Archbishop Thomas Cranmer placed the crown of England upon the head of a 9-year-old boy, the assembled nobles might have expected to see awe, nervousness, or even childish excitement cross the young king's features. Instead, they witnessed something that would haunt many of them for years to come, a cold smile of satisfaction. As if Edward Seymour had finally been handed a toy he had long desired to play with. The boy, who had spent his entire life being told he was God's chosen instrument, was finally ready to begin his work. Edward's first Privy Council meeting, held just 3 days after his coronation, established the template for what would become 6 years of unprecedented royal authoritarianism. The council chamber at Westminster had seen many heated debates during Henry VIII's reign, but never anything like the spectacle of a 9-year-old interrupting experienced statesmen to deliver lectures on Protestant doctrine. When Thomas Seymour, the new Lord Protector and Edward's uncle, suggested a moderate approach to religious reform, Edward cut him off mid-sentence. Rising from his chair with the imperious dignity his tutors had drilled into him, the boy king launched into a 20-minute discourse on the theological necessity of rapid Protestant purification. He quoted scripture in Latin, cited recent Protestant martyrs by name, and concluded with a chilling declaration that God would hold him personally responsible if he allowed Catholic corruption to persist in England. The silence that followed was profound. These were men who had survived Henry VIII's court, who had watched queens lose their heads and ministers fall from grace. But none of them had ever witnessed anything quite like this, a child speaking with the cold certainty of an inquisitor about the necessity of religious violence. The pattern that emerged over the following weeks would define Edward's entire reign. Each morning, the boy king would break his fast while reviewing the previous day's reports from around the kingdom, accounts of suspected Catholic activities, lists of individuals who had failed to attend Protestant services, descriptions of religious artifacts that needed to be destroyed. Edward read these reports with the same attention other children might give to fairy tales, making careful notes in the margins and occasionally laughing with delight when he read about particularly effective Protestant victories over Catholic resistance. After breakfast came the daily ritual that courtiers privately called the signing. Edward would review death warrants, judicial sentences, and religious proclamations with his Privy Council. But the final decisions were always his. What shocked observers was not just the boy king's eagerness to sign execution orders, but the obvious pleasure he took in the process. Edward would read each warrant carefully, sometimes asking for additional details about the condemned person's crimes, and then sign his name with a flourish that suggested he was autographing books for admirers rather than ordering human beings to their deaths. Court physicians who examined Edward during this period noted disturbing changes in his behavior. The boy who had once been merely precocious was becoming genuinely frightening. Edward had developed what could only be described as a scientific interest in suffering, asking detailed questions about execution methods and requesting that witnesses provide him with written reports describing condemned individuals' final moments. When one executioner mentioned that a particular Catholic priest had maintained his composure remarkably well during his burning, Edward spent an entire afternoon composing new regulations designed to make such spiritual obstinacy more difficult to maintain. But perhaps most disturbing of all were Edward's religious tantrums, explosive fits of rage that occurred whenever anyone suggested moderation in his Protestant policies. During one particularly memorable incident in March 1547, Archbishop Cranmer suggested that some Catholic shrines might be preserved as historical monuments rather than destroyed immediately. Edward's response was volcanic. He threw his inkwell at Cranmer, screamed that God would punish England for such weakness, and then spent the next hour pacing his chambers while dictating increasingly extreme proclamations about the necessity of complete Catholic elimination. These incidents were initially dismissed by Edward's handlers as normal childhood behavior, but careful observers noted something far more troubling. Edward's rages weren't random emotional outbursts. They were calculated performances designed to intimidate his advisors and establish his authority. After each tantrum, the boy king would return to his previous activities with perfect composure, as if nothing had happened. He was learning to use fear as a tool of governance, and he was remarkably good at it. The American parallel that comes closest to capturing Edward's psychological state would be imagining if the child of a modern cult leader had inherited the presidency at age 9, complete with nuclear launch codes and a cabinet of true believers. Edward possessed all the intellectual sophistication necessary to understand the machinery of power, but none of the emotional development that might have provided moral restraints on how he used that power. By the summer of 1547, courtiers were beginning to whisper about their growing fear of their young king. These were hardened political operators who had survived Henry VIII's court, men who understood that royal favor could turn to royal wrath with deadly speed. But Edward was different. His father had been unpredictable and violent, but his cruelty had at least been recognizably human, driven by passion, jealousy, or political necessity. Edward's cruelty was something else entirely, a cold, methodical application of violence in service of what he genuinely believed was a divine mission. The boy king was learning to treat human suffering as an intellectual exercise, and his subjects were beginning to realize that they were trapped in a kingdom ruled by someone who saw their pain as evidence of his own righteousness. By the autumn of 1547, Edward VI had moved beyond simply approving the executions planned by others. The 10-year-old king was beginning to design his own machinery of persecution, creating what would become the most sophisticated surveillance state Europe had ever seen. Edward's innovation wasn't just the scope of his religious monitoring, it was the personal enthusiasm he brought to the task. While adult tyrants might delegate the details of oppression to subordinates, Edward insisted on reviewing every aspect of his system personally. He kept detailed files on suspected Catholics throughout England, maintained correspondence with Protestant informants in every major town, and personally designed the reward system that encouraged his subjects to spy on their neighbors. The network Edward created was breathtaking in its scope and chilling in its effectiveness. Children were encouraged to report their parents' religious practices with promises of royal favor and material rewards. Servants were given incentives to monitor their master's private devotions. Neighbors were taught to see religious surveillance as a patriotic duty. Within 18 months of Edward's coronation, England had become a nation where privacy was treason and trust was a luxury no one could afford. What made Edward's system particularly effective was his personal involvement in its operation. Unlike historical surveillance states that relied on faceless bureaucracies, Edward's network centered on the king himself. Citizens knew that their denunciations would be read personally by their sovereign, that their religious loyalty would be judged by a boy who considered himself God's personal representative on earth. This wasn't just political oppression, it was spiritual terrorism, designed to make every English subject feel constantly watched by divine authority. Edward kept meticulous records of every denunciation, filing them in categories that revealed his increasingly sophisticated understanding of how fear could be used to control populations. He maintained separate files for active Catholics who attended illegal masses, passive Catholics who simply failed to show sufficient Protestant enthusiasm, Protestant waverers whose commitment seemed insufficient, and potential converts, Catholics, who might be convinced to change faiths through pressure or rewards. But the most disturbing aspect of Edward's surveillance system was the obvious pleasure he took in reading the reports his network generated. Courtiers noted that the boy king's mood would brighten visibly when particularly detailed denunciations arrived. Edward would read these reports aloud to his advisors, often adding his own commentary about the theological significance of various transgressions and the appropriate punishments for different types of religious crimes. The case of Margaret Whitmore, a kitchen maid at Greenwich Palace, provides a particularly chilling example of how Edward's system operated in practice. In November 1547, a fellow servant reported seeing Margaret cross herself while preparing vegetables, a gesture that could indicate Catholic sympathies. The report reached Edward within hours, and the boy king's response revealed the methodical cruelty that was becoming his trademark. Rather than ordering Margaret's immediate punishment, Edward designed what he called a spiritual correction process. Margaret was to be questioned daily about her religious beliefs, required to attend Protestant services twice daily, and forced to recite anti-Catholic prayers before each meal. Her responses would be monitored and recorded, providing Edward with data about the effectiveness of different conversion techniques. The experiment lasted 3 weeks. Margaret, terrified and confused, tried desperately to provide the answers her interrogators wanted, but her fear made her stumble over the complex theological formulations Edward required. Each mistake was recorded, analyzed, and used to justify escalating punishments. When Margaret finally collapsed during a forced prayer session, dying from what court physicians described as nervous exhaustion, Edward's only recorded response was a clinical note in his journal. Subject proved resistant to correction. More intensive methods required for future cases. This wasn't the isolated cruelty of a disturbed child. It was the systematic application of torture disguised as religious education. Edward had learned to treat human beings as laboratory animals, subjects for experiments in spiritual engineering that would help him perfect his techniques for converting or eliminating England's remaining Catholics. The surveillance network also served Edward's growing need for psychological stimulation. The boy king had developed what can only be described as an addiction to other people's fear, requiring increasingly detailed reports about his subjects' terror to maintain his sense of power and righteousness. He particularly enjoyed reading denunciations that described the emotional state of suspected Catholics, their fear when questioned, their desperation when interrogated, their breakdown when threatened with punishment. Edward kept a special file of what he called spiritual victory reports, detailed accounts of successful conversions from Catholicism to Protestantism. But these weren't simple religious conversion stories. They were psychological profiles that documented exactly how fear, isolation, and manipulation could be used to break down individual resistance to royal authority. Edward studied these reports like a general studying battlefield tactics, learning how to wage war against the human spirit itself. By 1548, England had become a nation where the most dangerous person you could know was a child, because children, encouraged by their king's example, had become some of the most enthusiastic participants in the surveillance system. Edward had created a kingdom where innocence itself had been weaponized, where the natural trust between family members had been poisoned by the promise of royal favor for successful denunciations. The American comparison that best captures the horror of Edward's system would be imagining a nation where every interaction was recorded, every private conversation reported, and every gesture analyzed for signs of insufficient loyalty, all overseen by someone whose moral development had been deliberately stunted and whose understanding of human suffering came entirely from academic study rather than personal experience. Edward VI had created hell on earth, and he was genuinely convinced that he was doing God's work. If Edward's treatment of his subjects revealed the depth of his cruelty, his attitude toward his own family exposed the complete absence of his humanity. By 1548, the 11-year-old king had begun to view his half-sisters Mary and Elizabeth not as family members deserving of love or even basic consideration, but as pieces on a political chessboard to be moved, manipulated, or eliminated according to the demands of his Protestant vision. Mary Tudor, 20 years Edward's senior and a devout Catholic, represented everything her young brother had been taught to hate. But Edward's feelings toward Mary went far beyond the political calculation that might have motivated an adult ruler. His private letters, preserved in the royal archives, reveal a hatred so intense and personal that it shocked even his most radical advisors. In correspondence with Protestant allies, Edward referred to Mary consistently as the bastard and Christ's enemy, but these public epithets barely hinted at the depths of his private obsession. In his personal journals, Edward wrote about Mary with a mixture of theological disgust and childish vindictiveness that was genuinely disturbing. He fantasized about scenarios where he could legally have Mary executed for heresy, describing in elaborate detail the charges he would bring against her and the public spectacle he would make of her trial and execution. Edward's hatred of Mary consumed him in ways that worried even his most committed supporters. The boy king would spend hours devising legal strategies for eliminating Mary from the succession, consulting with Protestant lawyers who were all too willing to find constitutional justifications for what amounted to judicial murder. Edward commissioned detailed studies of historical precedents for executing royal family members, paying particular attention to cases where religious differences had been used to justify extreme measures. But Edward's plans for dealing with Mary went far beyond simple execution. He envisioned her destruction as a public demonstration of Protestant triumph over Catholic error. In documents that read like the fantasies of a particularly disturbed child, Edward outlined scenarios where Mary would be forced to publicly renounce her Catholic faith, acknowledge her own illegitimacy, and beg forgiveness for her years of opposition to God's true church. Only then, after this ritual humiliation, would she be granted the mercy of a quick death rather than being burned alive, like other heretics. The most chilling aspect of Edward's anti-Mary obsession was how it revealed his complete inability to understand family relationships in normal human terms. When advisors occasionally suggested that his harsh attitude toward Mary might be inappropriate given their family connection, Edward would respond with genuine confusion. From his perspective, family relationships were simply another category of political alliance, to be maintained or severed based entirely on their usefulness to his religious mission. Edward's treatment of Elizabeth was more complex, but equally disturbing in its own way. Because Elizabeth had embraced Protestant beliefs, she avoided the worst of Edward's hatred, but this relative favor came with its own form of dehumanization. Edward saw Elizabeth primarily as a useful tool for advancing Protestant interests, particularly through marriage alliances that could strengthen England's connections with other Protestant nations. The Boy King's correspondence about Elizabeth's future reveals a mind that was incapable of considering her personal happiness or individual desires. Edward planned to use Elizabeth's marriage as a way to cement Protestant alliances, treating her future happiness as completely irrelevant compared to the political advantages her union might bring to his cause. In letters to Protestant princes across Europe, Edward described Elizabeth like a valuable commodity to be traded for the right political considerations, showing no awareness that he was discussing the fate of his own sister. Even Edward's relatively positive feelings toward Elizabeth were filtered through his religious obsessions in ways that made normal sibling affection impossible. He valued Elizabeth only insofar as she served his Protestant agenda, making it clear that his sister's worth was entirely conditional on her continued religious orthodoxy. If Elizabeth had ever shown signs of Catholic sympathy, there's little doubt that Edward would have turned on her with the same vicious hatred he directed toward Mary. The case of Thomas Seymour, Edward's uncle, provided perhaps the clearest illustration of how completely the boy king had lost the capacity for normal human relationships. Thomas had shown genuine kindness to Edward during his childhood, bringing him gifts, telling him stories, and treating him with the sort of casual affection that had been almost entirely absent from the prince's life. When Thomas was arrested on charges of treason in 1549, many observers expected Edward to show at least some reluctance about authorizing his uncle's execution. Instead, Edward's response was coldly calculating. He not only supported Thomas's execution, but insisted on receiving detailed reports about his uncle's behavior during imprisonment. Edward wanted to know whether Thomas had maintained his composure, whether he had begged for mercy, whether he had shown signs of fear. When the execution finally took place, Edward reportedly watched from his window at the Tower of London. Making notes in his journal about the effectiveness of different aspects of the proceedings after Thomas's death. Edward's only recorded comment was a clinical observation about the instructional value of seeing how quickly personal relationships could be subordinated to political necessity. He showed no grief, no regret, and no awareness that he had just participated in the judicial murder of someone who had genuinely cared for him. The boy who should have been mourning a beloved uncle was instead analyzing the educational benefits of his death. By 1549, Edward had established himself as someone who was literally incapable of forming normal human attachments. His family members were political assets or liabilities. His advisors were tools for implementing his vision. His subjects were experimental subjects for his theories about religious conversion and social control. He had become, in the most literal sense, a monster, not because he was inherently evil, but because the capacity for basic human empathy had been systematically destroyed during his development. The tragedy of Edward's family relationships wasn't just personal. It was a preview of how he would eventually treat an entire kingdom. A boy who couldn't love his own sisters was hardly likely to show mercy to strangers who opposed his will. By 1552, Edward's declining health had begun to focus his mind on what he saw as the ultimate test of his reign, ensuring that his Protestant revolution would survive his death. The 15-year-old king knew that Mary's accession would mean the restoration of Catholicism, and this knowledge drove him to contemplate solutions that would have horrified even his tyrannical father. Working with John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, who had emerged as Edward's chief advisor, the boy king began crafting what amounted to a plan for religious genocide disguised as a succession crisis. The conspiracy that emerged was breathtaking in its audacity and chilling in its detailed preparation for mass murder. Edward's central innovation was the decision to bypass both of his sisters in favor of Lady Jane Grey, his Protestant cousin, whose religious orthodoxy was beyond question. But this wasn't simply a matter of changing the succession. It was the first step in a comprehensive plan to eliminate Catholic influence from England permanently. The boy king's personal involvement in planning these atrocities was both detailed and enthusiastic. Despite his physical weakness, Edward threw himself into the conspiracy with an energy that amazed and frightened his co-conspirators. He spent his declining days drafting lists of Catholics to be executed, properties to be seized, and laws to be enacted in what he called his New Jerusalem, an England purified of Catholic corruption and ruled by Protestant extremists. Edward's handwriting, increasingly shaky due to his illness, filled page after page with plans for what amounted to the first modern genocidal campaign. The device for the succession, as historians would later call Edward's illegal attempt to alter the royal succession, was just the tip of the iceberg. The real horror lay in the supporting documents that outlined Edward's vision for post-succession England. The king's plans included provisions for the immediate arrest of all known Catholic nobles, the seizure of all Catholic properties, and the establishment of a permanent religious police force that would monitor every aspect of English spiritual life. But these were just the opening moves in a campaign that Edward envisioned lasting for years. His ultimate goal was nothing less than the complete elimination of Catholic belief from English soil, achieved through a combination of forced conversion, exile, and systematic execution. Edward had learned from studying historical religious conflicts that successful religious purification required careful planning and methodical execution. His conspiracy included detailed provisions for organizing England's Catholics into categories based on their level of resistance to Protestant conversion. Hardened Catholics would be executed immediately as examples to others. Moderate Catholics would be given opportunities to convert under close supervision. Catholic sympathizers would face property confiscation and social ostracism until they embraced Protestant orthodoxy. But perhaps most disturbing of all was Edward's plan for dealing with children from Catholic families. The boy king had become convinced that Catholic beliefs were so dangerous that they constituted a form of spiritual child abuse. His conspiracy included provisions for removing children from Catholic parents and placing them in Protestant households where they could be properly educated in true religion. These weren't adoption programs. They were plans for the systematic destruction of Catholic family structures across England. Edward's correspondence with Protestant extremists across Europe reveals the international scope of his ambitions. The boy king saw his English purification as the first step in a broader campaign to eliminate Catholic influence from all of Northern Europe. He envisioned England as the base for a Protestant crusade that would spread Reformed religion across the continent through a combination of military force and systematic persecution. The level of detailed planning that Edward brought to this conspiracy was remarkable for someone of any age, but particularly disturbing in a 15-year-old. He had developed sophisticated theories about the most effective methods for breaking down Catholic resistance, drawing on his years of experience with England's surveillance system. Edward understood that successful religious persecution required not just violence, but psychological warfare designed to destroy people's will to resist. The conspiracy also revealed Edward's growing megalomania. By 1552, the boy king had begun to see himself not just as England's ruler, but as God's chosen instrument for purifying Christianity itself. His private letters from this period are filled with grandiose claims about his divine mission and detailed prophecies about the Protestant paradise he would create after eliminating Catholic opposition. John Dudley, despite his own Protestant extremism, began to have private doubts about the scope of Edward's plans. The Duke of Northumberland was a hardened political operator who had survived decades of Tudor court intrigue, but even he was disturbed by the systematic nature of Edward's proposed persecutions. When Dudley occasionally suggested that some of the king's plans might be too extreme, Edward would respond with the same cold fury he had shown toward anyone who questioned his religious policies. The most chilling aspect of Edward's final conspiracy was how it revealed the complete absence of any moral restraints on his use of power. The boy who had been raised to believe that opposition to his will was literally sinful had developed plans that would have made the Spanish Inquisition look merciful by comparison. Edward was preparing to turn England into a laboratory for testing the most extreme forms of religious persecution ever devised. By early 1553, as Edward's health continued to deteriorate, the conspiracy had taken on an urgency that reflected the king's growing awareness of his own mortality. He knew that he was running out of time to implement his vision, and this knowledge drove him to increasingly desperate measures. The dying boy king spent his final weeks trying to compress a lifetime of religious purification into whatever time remained to him. But Edward's illness carried a cruel irony that seemed almost like divine justice. The king, who had spent years poisoning England with religious hatred, was himself being slowly poisoned by the very physicians trying to save his life. Stuff. By the spring of 1553, Edward VI's body was beginning to betray him in ways that seemed almost cosmically appropriate. Modern medical analysis suggests that the boy king was suffering from a combination of tuberculosis and chronic arsenic poisoning, the latter likely administered by his own physicians in their well-intentioned but misguided attempts to treat his declining health with the mercury and arsenic compounds that passed for medicine in the 16th century. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers. The king who had spent years poisoning England's spiritual atmosphere with religious hatred was now being literally poisoned by the very people trying to save his life. Edward's physicians, desperate to cure their royal patient, had unknowingly begun a process that would make his final months a living hell of physical agony matched only by the intensity of his spiritual obsessions. The first signs of arsenic poisoning manifested in ways that courtiers initially dismissed as normal illness. Edward's appetite decreased, his energy flagged, and he began experiencing the stomach pains and nausea that his physicians attributed to his existing respiratory problems. But by early summer, more disturbing symptoms had begun to appear. Edward's skin took on a grayish pallor that no amount of cosmetics could disguise. His hair, once thick and golden like his father's, began falling out in clumps that his barbers had to carefully remove from his pillows each morning. Most disturbing of all, his fingernails started dropping off, a symptom that terrified his attendants even as they struggled to understand its cause. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect of Edward's physical deterioration was the smell. By June 1553, the boy king's body had begun emitting a putrid odor that grew stronger each day, despite the desperate efforts of his servants to mask it with perfumes and incense. The smell was so overwhelming that courtiers began making excuses to avoid attending council meetings, and even Edward's closest advisors started pressing perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces when forced to spend time in his presence. Court physicians recorded their growing alarm as Edward's condition worsened. The king's body seemed to be rotting from the inside out, his internal organs slowly failing as the accumulated arsenic destroyed his kidneys, liver, and digestive system. His abdomen became distended and painful, his breathing increasingly labored, and his periods of consciousness grew shorter and less coherent. Yet through all of this physical agony, Edward's mental obsessions only intensified. Rather than moderating his extremism in the face of approaching death, the dying king seemed to burn with an even fiercer religious fervor, as if his physical torment was somehow feeding his spiritual fanaticism. During his lucid moments, Edward would dictate increasingly violent proclamations about the necessity of Protestant purification, his fevered mind generating ever more elaborate plans for the elimination of Catholic influence. The king's hallucinations, brought on by the toxins coursing through his system, took on distinctly religious themes that revealed the depth of his psychological conditioning. Edward claimed to see Protestant martyrs urging him toward greater extremism, Catholic demons trying to corrupt his soul, and visions of the New Jerusalem he would create if only he could survive long enough to complete his work. His attendants never knew whether these were genuine hallucinations or calculated performances designed to reinforce his image as God's chosen instrument. Edward's final weeks were marked by violent convulsions that would leave him temporarily paralyzed, followed by periods of apparent clarity during which he would resume his obsessive planning for England's Protestant future. The boy who had once been considered one of the most beautiful of Henry VIII's children had become a grotesque shadow of his former self, his body a horrifying testament to the poison that had been destroying him from within. Perhaps most disturbing of all, Edward remained lucid enough to understand what was happening to his body, and his response revealed the complete absence of normal human emotion that had characterized his entire reign. Rather than expressing fear, regret, or desire for reconciliation, the dying king spent his remaining energy cursing his Catholic sister and planning for the continuation of his religious purification even after his death. The physicians who attended Edward during his final illness recorded their amazement at his apparent indifference to his own suffering. While most patients in his condition would have been consumed by physical pain and fear of death, Edward seemed almost excited by his approaching end, as if he saw his martyrdom as the final proof of his divine mission. He spoke repeatedly about joining the Protestant saints in heaven, where he would continue his work of opposing Catholic corruption from beyond the grave. Edward's final conversations were not about forgiveness, family reconciliation, or spiritual peace, but about his regret that he wouldn't live to complete his planned purification of England. The dying king begged his conspirators to proceed with their plot, even without him, promising them that God would reward their faithfulness in establishing his Protestant paradise. As June turned to July, it became clear that Edward's death was imminent, but even as his body failed, his mind remained focused on the conspiracy he had helped create. The boy who had never learned to love anyone was preparing to die as he had lived consumed by hatred and convinced that his suffering was somehow noble because it served what he believed was God's will. June 1553 brought a desperate urgency to Edward's conspiracy as the boy king's declining health made it clear that time was running out. The 15-year-old, who had spent years planning the systematic elimination of England's Catholics, now faced the terrifying possibility that his carefully crafted vision might die with him. This knowledge drove Edward to increasingly frantic efforts to accelerate his conspiracy's timeline, even as his body continued its inexorable collapse. Edward's device for the succession, the illegal document that would bypass both Mary and Elizabeth in favor of Lady Jane Grey, represented only the most visible aspect of a much larger conspiracy. Behind this constitutional crisis lay the boy king's detailed plans for what he called the Final Reformation, a comprehensive program of religious persecution that would make his previous policies look moderate by comparison. Working from his increasingly frequent sickbed, Edward spent his final weeks dictating instructions that revealed the full scope of his megalomaniacal vision. He compiled lists of Catholic nobles to be arrested immediately upon Lady Jane's accession, their properties to be seized and redistributed to Protestant supporters. He drafted proclamations that would make any expression of Catholic belief punishable by death, effectively outlawing not just Catholic practice, but Catholic thought itself. But Edward's plans went far beyond simple persecution. He envisioned the systematic re-education of England's population through what he called spiritual correction centers institutions where suspected Catholics would be subjected to intensive Protestant indoctrination until they either converted or died from the rigors of the process. The boy king had developed detailed curricula for these centers, including specific techniques for breaking down Catholic resistance through a combination of physical hardship, psychological manipulation, and theological browbeating. The international scope of Edward's ambitions became clear in his correspondence with Protestant leaders across Europe. The dying king saw his English purification as the opening move in a broader campaign to eliminate Catholic influence from all of Northern Europe. He promised military support to Protestant revolutionaries in France, financial assistance to Protestant rebels in the Low Countries, and coordination with Protestant princes in Germany for a simultaneous assault on Catholic power across the continent. Edward's personal involvement in these planning sessions was both remarkable and deeply disturbing. Despite his physical weakness, the boy king insisted on reviewing every detail of the conspiracy personally, often spending hours dictating refinements to plans for mass arrests, property seizures, and religious trials. His advisors noted with alarm that Edward seemed most energetic when discussing the most violent aspects of his program, as if the prospect of widespread suffering somehow invigorated him. The legal framework Edward created for his succession crisis revealed his sophisticated understanding of how constitutional mechanisms could be manipulated to serve extremist purposes. The device wasn't simply an arbitrary change to the royal succession. It was carefully crafted to appear legitimate while actually representing a complete overthrow of established law. Edward had learned from his tutors that successful tyranny required the appearance of legality, and his final conspiracy demonstrated his mastery of this lesson. But perhaps most chilling of all was Edward's attitude toward the inevitable resistance his plans would generate. The boy king had developed detailed contingency plans for dealing with opposition, including provisions for summary executions of anyone who questioned Lady Jane's legitimacy. Edward envisioned turning England into a battlefield where Protestant extremists would wage systematic war against anyone who resisted their authority. The conspiracy also revealed Edward's complete disconnection from normal human relationships, as he finalized his plans for excluding Mary and Elizabeth from the succession. The dying king showed no awareness that he was effectively ordering the deaths of his own sisters. From Edward's perspective, family relationships were simply obstacles to be overcome in service of his religious mission. During his final council meetings, held in his bedchamber as he grew too weak to leave his bed, Edward displayed a combination of childish petulance and cold calculation that terrified even his most committed supporters. When John Dudley occasionally expressed doubts about the conspiracy's more extreme aspects, Edward would respond with rage so intense that it would trigger violent coughing fits that left him gasping for breath. But as soon as these episodes passed, he would return to his planning with renewed determination, as if his physical suffering somehow validated his spiritual mission. Edward's final weeks were also marked by increasingly grandiose claims about his divine authority. The boy king began referring to himself as God's sword, claiming that his approaching death was actually a strategic withdrawal that would allow him to direct England's purification from heaven itself. He promised his conspirators that his martyrdom would inspire Protestant extremists across Europe to rise up and complete the work he had begun. By late June, it was clear that Edward's death was imminent, but the boy king refused to acknowledge the failure of his conspiracy. Even as his body shut down, he continued dictating refinements to plans that would never be implemented. Writing letters to foreign Protestant leaders who would never receive them, and issuing proclamations for a Protestant paradise that would never exist. The final irony of Edward's conspiracy was how completely it depended on his personal authority. Without the boy king's driving will behind it, the entire elaborate structure began to collapse even before his death. Moderate Protestants, who had supported Edward's policies out of loyalty to the crown, began to distance themselves from plans they recognized as extremist fantasies. Even some of Edward's most committed supporters started making contingency plans for Mary's inevitable accession. But Edward himself remained convinced until the end that his conspiracy would succeed. The boy who had never experienced failure, never been told no, and never learned to accept limitations simply couldn't imagine that his will might not be sufficient to reshape reality according to his desires. July 6, 1553, 8:00 p.m. Greenwich Palace fell silent as Edward VI drew his final breath, ending 6 years of rule that had transformed England into a nation held hostage by the fevered dreams of a child who believed himself to be God's personal representative on earth. The boy king's death came not with the dramatic declarations of faith that might have been expected from someone so obsessed with religious purity, but with a series of incoherent whispers that mixed theological babbling with personal curses against his Catholic sister. Edward's final words, as recorded by the clerk who maintained vigil at his bedside, were neither peaceful nor forgiving. Let not Mary, the bastard, corrupt God's England, Protestant paradise, my vision. The dying king's last coherent statement was reportedly a fevered plea for his conspirators to proceed with their planned coup, even without him, promising them divine reward for completing his work of religious purification. The immediate aftermath of Edward's death revealed how completely his carefully constructed conspiracy had been built on the foundation of his personal authority. Within hours of the king's passing, the elaborate network of Protestant extremists who had spent months planning their coup began to unravel with stunning speed. John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, who had been Edward's chief co-conspirator, found himself virtually friendless as moderate Protestants abandoned what they now recognized as an impossible cause. Lady Jane Grey, the intended beneficiary of Edward's illegal succession device, discovered that political legitimacy couldn't be manufactured through clever legal documents when the underlying support simply didn't exist. The young woman who had been chosen as Edward's puppet queen found herself proclaimed ruler of England on July 10th. But by July 19th, she was effectively a prisoner in the Tower of London as support for Mary Tudor grew across the kingdom. The collapse of Edward's conspiracy represented more than just a political failure. It was a comprehensive rejection of the extremist vision that had driven his entire reign. Even committed Protestants who had supported Edward's religious reforms found themselves welcoming Catholic Mary as a preferable alternative to the continued rule of Protestant fanatics. The boy king who had dreamed of becoming England's greatest Protestant champion had instead ensured that his reign would be remembered primarily for its cruelty and the relief that followed his death. Mary Tudor's successful claim to the throne was supported not just by Catholics grateful for liberation from Protestant persecution, but by moderate Protestants who were horrified by what Edward's reign had revealed about the potential for religious extremism. The broad coalition that rallied to Mary's cause represented a national consensus that Edward's vision of Protestant England had become too dangerous to tolerate. Perhaps the most telling indication of how Edward's reign was perceived by his contemporaries came in the form of what didn't happen after his death. There were no public monuments erected to his memory, no popular movements calling for the continuation of his policies, no martyrdom narratives constructed around his early death. Instead, there was a collective sigh of relief that seemed to echo across the entire kingdom. The immediate restoration of Catholic practices under Mary revealed how shallow Edward's Protestant reforms had actually been outside the circles of committed extremists. Churches that had been stripped of their Catholic ornaments were quickly restored. Priests who had been driven into hiding emerged to resume their ministrations. The surveillance network that had terrorized England's Catholics collapsed overnight as informants discovered that their services were no longer required or welcomed. But the most damning verdict on Edward's reign came from the Protestant community itself. Leading Protestant theologians who had initially supported Edward's reforms began to distance themselves from the extremist policies that had characterized his rule. They recognized that the boy king's fanaticism had actually harmed the Protestant cause by making Reformed religion synonymous with persecution and political extreme.